Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're sinking our teeth into the 2026 horror film Obsession, directed by Curry Barker. But look, we aren't just doing this for the jump scares, right? We're actually using this movie because it's a completely brilliant, albeit very dark, vehicle to decode the human mind. We're going to strip away all that supernatural horror to get at something incredibly real: internal family systems therapy, or IFS for short. Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the IFS model and obsession. Then, we'll break down Bear's internal tragedy, followed by the collapse of Nikki's self. Fourth, we'll examine the Wish Willow bargain. Fifth is love versus possession, and we'll wrap it all up with the exit through therapy.
All right, Section 1, the IFS model and obsession. This is where we see the mind fracture.
So let's set the stage here. The whole premise of this movie absolutely nails the horrific imbalance that happens when our extreme desires completely overshadow who we truly are. Now, in internal family systems therapy, there's this fundamental concept called the self. Think of this as the core entity of your mind. By nature, it's calm, it's confident, and it's compassionate. And the real tragedy in this film, honestly, long before any of the supernatural stuff kicks off, begins when our main character, Bear, completely loses his connection to this steady, compassionate core. When the self is no longer in the driver's seat, well, that's exactly when his mind starts to fracture.
Now, what's super fascinating to me is how we can take this entire psychological toolkit and just map it right onto the movie's plot. In IFS, the mind is made up of parts. First up, you have exiles. These parts carry deep pain, like Bear's absolutely crushing feelings of unworthiness. Then you've got managers. These guys try to rigidly control reality just to stop that pain from bubbling up. And finally, you have firefighters. When that pain threatens to break through anyway, firefighters jump in to put it out with impulsive, usually reckless actions. So, in the movie, Bear using that magical artifact to literally force someone to love him, that is the ultimate firefighter action.
Moving on to Section 2, Bear's internal tragedy. We're looking at a deeply wounded system here.
So, we need to take a second to clinically but empathetically deconstruct our villain. Because the thing about IFS is there are no bad parts. There are only parts that get forced into really extreme roles. Bear isn't just some one-dimensional movie monster making evil choices for the fun of it. His actions are entirely driven by his exile. This is a profoundly wounded internal part of him that's carrying around this massive weight of loneliness, unworthiness, and just a terrifying fear of rejection. So his desperate need to make Nikki love him, it isn't actually about Nikki at all. It's a frantic, desperate attempt by his internal system to soothe a massive, unhealed fear of abandonment from his own past. But here's the kicker. When Bear actually makes his wish using that supernatural toy, a firefighter part violently hijacks his entire psychological system, and its only goal, to extinguish his emotional pain immediately, literally by any means necessary. It completely bypasses genuine human connection. If we're speaking clinically, obsession is exactly this. It's when a firefighter part locks onto a single target just to numb the pain of an exile. It takes something like love and violently twists it into toxic, suffocating possession.
Which really leaves us with a pretty chilling question to chew on. Can we ever actually find true happiness by forcing our desires onto the world? Or is that kind of coercion just the starting line for our own internal disintegration? Usually, when we completely bypass our true self just to get what we want, the prize ends up rotting right in our hands.
That brings us to Section 3, the collapse of Nikki's self, or what we can call internal gaslighting. Let's shift gears for a second and look at the victim, Nikki, to really explore this terrifying concept. What happens to Nikki is, for all intents and purposes, an internal system glitch. It is a forced hacking of a totally healthy mind. Bear's wish essentially implants these fake emotions into her, and that creates a brand new exile inside her. This part holding profound confusion because her body is acting out love, but her intuition knows the whole thing is completely fabricated. Her internal managers, the parts that normally set healthy boundaries and say no, they get completely hacked and disabled by this magic. As her system realizes it's under attack, her firefighters sound the alarm, triggering extreme panic attacks. Ultimately, just to survive the sheer, overwhelming cognitive dissonance of it all, she has to dissociate. She's literally forced to detach from reality.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. The scariest part of this movie is definitely not the supernatural gore or the jump scares. Not at all. It's the total occupation and destruction of a healthy internal system by an outside force. Nikki loses her autonomy completely.
She is reduced to a hollowed-out vessel, forced to host someone else's desires. And man, that is true, inescapable psychological horror.
All right, on to Section 4, the One Wish Willow bargain. Let's talk about toxic shortcuts. Let's look at the actual mechanism driving all of this. Is the One Wish Willow just a clever horror movie prop to keep the plot moving? Or is it a symbol for a really toxic real-world bargain? I invite you to look past the cinematic illusion here, because if you step into an actual therapy office, we see this exact same dynamic play out all the time. Just, without the glowing supernatural twigs. In the context of IFS, this object is basically a destructive Faustian bargain. It's the ultimate quick fix that promises instant relief, entirely bypassing the really hard work of true healing that comes through the self. When you rely on a quick fix in real life, think of things like an addiction or trying to manipulate someone else. You are trading your personal freedom for the illusion of guaranteed safety. But by doing that, you just end up creating new, way heavier psychological burdens for yourself. You chain yourself to a specific outcome. The whole thing relies entirely on this super dangerous illusion that if we can just control the people around us, we'll finally be at peace.
Let's look at Section 5, love versus possession, two extreme opposites.
This really sets up the ultimate contrast of our explainer today. Just look at the stark difference here. Self-led love is calm, it's compassionate, and it's confident. It fundamentally respects the other person's freedom, right? It builds a safe space where both people can actually grow. But on the flip side, part-led obsession is extreme, it's fearful, and it's fiercely controlling. It uses psychological coercion, whether that's literal magic in a horror movie or just manipulation in the real world, solely to extinguish its own personal pain. And the great tragedy of Bear's internal collapse boils down to exactly this. Bear didn't actually love Nikki. Not really. He only loved the feeling of being loved. He essentially used her as an emotional drug to soothe his exile. And in his obsessive, frantic attempt to force that feeling, he turned Nikki into this zombie-like entity, literally killing the genuine human connection he was so desperately craving in the first place. Finally, Section 6, the exit through therapy, real-world healing. Now, let's break the cinematic illusion for a minute and pivot to a more empowering, real-world psychological solution. We really have to ask, is there a way out for someone like Bear? Well, if we step out of the horror genre and back into reality, the answer is a resounding yes. There is absolutely a hopeful clinical reality here that doesn't have to end in total destruction. Here is the exact step-by-step progression of IFS therapy that could actually heal Bear's wounded system. First up is unblending. Bear has to realize his obsessive firefighter part isn't his whole identity. He has to learn to step back from it. Second is befriending. Instead of hating his own obsession, his core self needs to understand that it's just a part trying its best to protect him from pain. Third is witnessing. Now, this one is absolutely crucial. Bear's self has to go back to that inner child, that exile, and actually witness its past pain and its fear of abandonment. And finally, unburdening. Once the exile finally feels seen and safe with Bear's own self, it can release that heavy, toxic belief that it desperately needs someone else to be worthy. By actually going through this therapeutic process, that frantic urge to use the One Wish Willow completely vanishes. Why? Because true peace comes from internal connection, not external manipulation. The ultimate goal of IFS isn't to force the world to bend to your fears. It's to build such a strong, compassionate relationship with your own core self that you don't even need a magical quick fix to feel whole. So think about how this applies far beyond a movie screen. In our modern lives, we obviously might not have a cursed willow branch sitting around, but we definitely have our own shortcuts. Are we getting too reliant on modern magic? Things like the instant, fleeting validation of social media or subtle emotional manipulation to cure our own profound loneliness. If we use external forces to constantly silence our internal exiles, we might just be writing our very own psychological horror story. It's definitely something deeply important to think about the next time you find yourself reaching for a quick fix instead of looking inward. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Catch you next time.